In the spring of 1947, in the hills and forests of Madagascar, the night skies glowed red with fire. Villages once filled with laughter and the smell of cooking rice were engulfed in flames, their people scattered, their futures uncertain. The world beyond the island barely noticed, but for the Malagasy, this was a moment of reckoning. After generations of colonial rule, they had chosen to rise. With little more than machetes, spears, and unshakable resolve, they confronted one of the most powerful empires of the age, France. It was a rebellion born from contradiction. Only 2 years earlier, the French had emerged victorious from World War II, speaking of liberty, democracy, and the rights of all peoples. Malagasy soldiers had fought in that war, spilling blood on foreign soil under the tricolor flag. They returned home believing they had earned respect, perhaps even the possibility of independence. Instead, they found the same chains of forced labor, crushing taxes, and a government deaf to their cries. To them, the promise of liberty was not a gift to be handed down, it was something that must be claimed. So when rebellion spread in March 1947, it did not come as a surprise to those who had long endured humiliation. Farmers abandoned their fields to join the fight, workers left plantations, veterans brought their knowledge of battle back to the island's soil. The uprising was not led by a single general, but by countless ordinary men and women who believed freedom was worth any price. They struck French outposts in the highlands, destroyed symbols of authority, and declared that Madagascar's future belonged to its own people. But the cost was catastrophic. The French colonial administration answered not with negotiation, but with overwhelming violence. Soldiers swept through the countryside, burning villages suspected of aiding rebels. Entire communities were executed in retaliation. Planes dropped bombs on rural areas where fighters were believed to hide. Tens of thousands of Malagasy men, women, and children were killed in one of the bloodiest colonial crackdowns of the 20th century. The rebellion, once a flame of hope, was drowned in blood. And yet, this tragedy remained hidden from the world. France downplayed the scale, calling it a minor disturbance, a fringe mutiny. Newspapers in Europe devoted only a few lines to it, while official reports deliberately erased the suffering. For decades, the truth was spoken only in whispers, passed down in families who remembered the day the soldiers came. The rest of the world moved on, as if nothing had happened. But history cannot remain buried forever. Survivors carried memories like scars, and in time, their voices resurfaced. They told of fathers dragged away, mothers clutching infants as homes went up in flames, and fields where bodies lay unburied. They told of courage in the face of impossible odds, of men and women who chose to resist rather than remain silent. Their testimony revealed a story far larger, far more haunting than the world had been willing to acknowledge. So who were these rebels who dared to rise against an empire? Why has their sacrifice been forgotten in the pages of history? And what does Madagascar's 1947 rebellion teach us about freedom, about the price of independence, and about the silence of nations that prefer to bury their darkest chapters? This is not just the tale of an uprising. It is the story of a people who stood at the edge of despair and still found the courage to fight. It is the forgotten fight for independence, a story of fire and blood, silence and survival, and a legacy that refuses to die. Madagascar had long been more than a colony. It was a jewel France was unwilling to lose. Sitting in the Indian Ocean, the island was rich in rice, coffee, and spices, and its strategic position made it valuable for trade and military routes. But beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity lay the lives of millions who worked the land with little reward, trapped under a system designed to benefit only the colonizers. For the Malagasy, every harvest was a reminder that their labor fed another nation while their own children went hungry. The contradictions sharpened during World War II. Thousands of Malagasy men had been conscripted to fight for France, some serving in North Africa, others in Europe, far from their island homes. They fought under orders, many without understanding why, and yet they endured the same dangers as French soldiers. When the war ended, survivors returned with medals on their chests and stories of courage. But back in Madagascar, there was no recognition, no improvement, only the same forced labor and degrading treatment. Their pride in surviving the war clashed bitterly with the humiliation of colonial rule. This sense of betrayal became fuel for the MDRM, the Mouvement Démocratique de la Rénovation Malgache. Founded by Malagasy leaders, the movement sought independence through politics, using words and petitions rather than weapons. In the halls of Antananarivo, they debated the future of their nation, imagining a Madagascar free to govern itself. But the French authorities saw these calls not as dialogue, but as a threat. They dismissed the party as dangerous dreamers, and their refusal only deepened resentment. Meanwhile, discontent brewed in villages and towns. Farmers were ordered to hand over rice at unfair prices, their granaries emptied while their families starved. Workers were forced to toil on plantations or build roads with little pay. Even minor defiance was punished harshly. Resentment became part of daily life, whispered in markets, shared at night around cooking fires. It was no longer just an intellectual debate in the capital, it was the quiet anger of the people. By March 1947, this anger could no longer be contained. In the eastern highlands, where the forests were dense and villages scattered, the first coordinated attacks began. Rebels struck French outposts at night, armed with machetes, spears, and a few stolen rifles. They targeted symbols of authority, administrative offices, police stations, plantations, declaring that Madagascar would no longer bow to France. News of the attacks spread quickly, igniting uprisings in other regions. For the first time in generations, the island rose in defiance. The colonial administration was stunned. They had believed Madagascar to be secure, its people docile. But now, entire districts were slipping out of their grasp. The French military scrambled reinforcements, but the terrain gave rebels an advantage. They knew the hidden paths, the valleys where soldiers could be ambushed, the rivers that could swallow supplies. For a brief moment, hope surged among the Malagasy. Perhaps victory was possible, perhaps freedom was within reach. Yet France was determined to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. Within weeks, troops poured into the island, supported by planes, heavy weapons, and brutal orders. They launched scorched-earth campaigns, ratissage, designed not just to defeat fighters but to terrorize civilians. Villages suspected of sympathy were burned to the ground, crops destroyed, livestock killed. Families fled into forests, only to face hunger and disease. The rebellion that had begun as a cry for freedom was met with fire and steel. Witnesses would later speak of massacres that defied imagination. In some regions, entire communities were lined up and shot as warnings to others. In others, elders were tortured, their screams echoing through villages before silence fell. Children were not spared. The soil of Madagascar became soaked with blood, and the sky itself seemed to carry the smoke of suffering. The French called it pacification, but to the Malagasy, it was a slaughter. Still, the rebels did not surrender easily. In forests and mountains, small bands continued to strike, ambushing convoys, disappearing into the night. Their weapons were crude, their numbers dwindling, but their spirit remained fierce. They sang ancestral chants, invoking the spirits of the land to guide them. To fight was not just resistance, it was remembrance, a way of telling the world that Madagascar's people were alive, unbroken, and unwilling to fade into silence. The rebellion spread quickly at first, from the forests of the east to the high plateaus of the center. Fighters used ambushes and sudden raids, striking at convoys, disrupting communication lines, and spreading fear among French settlers. For a few weeks, the dream of a liberated Madagascar seemed almost tangible. Villagers whispered of independence, of a dawn where their children would no longer bow to colonial officials. But hope was fragile, and France was determined to extinguish it. French troops arrived in force, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery. They carried not just orders to restore control, but instructions to make the Malagasy pay dearly for daring to rise. Villages accused of harboring rebels were surrounded, their inhabitants forced into the open. Houses were set ablaze while families watched, and anyone suspected of sympathy was executed on the spot. These were not battles between armies, they were massacres against civilians. Entire communities were uprooted. Witnesses described the ratissage, the systematic sweeps where soldiers advanced through valleys, burning everything in their path. Fields of rice were torched, leaving nothing but ash where food had once grown. Livestock was slaughtered, water sources poisoned, and famine followed the violence. Survivors fled deeper into the forests, where hunger gnawed at their bodies and disease spread in the damp. To resist meant risking death, but to surrender often meant the same. The cruelty was not hidden. Some French officers even reported their own unease at the scale of repression, but their words were buried in official archives. The colonial administration called the actions necessary, labeling the rebellion as savagery that had to be suppressed. But the truth was clear to those who lived it. The repression was meant to break the spirit of an entire people, to remind them that empire tolerated no challenge. By late 1947, the rebellion had lost much of its strength. Rebels who had once struck boldly now survived in small bands, hungry and outnumbered. Weapons were scarce, and ammunition scarcer still. Still, they fought where they could, ambushing patrols, cutting roads, refusing to disappear. Their courage was undeniable, but the imbalance was overwhelming. Against planes, artillery, and endless reinforcements, machetes and spears could not prevail. Estimates of the dead vary, but most agree that at least 80,000 Malagasy lost their lives. Some were fighters, but many were civilians, farmers, women, children caught in the fury of colonial revenge. Entire regions were scarred, their villages erased, their cemeteries filled with shallow graves. For Madagascar, the rebellion became both a wound and a symbol. For France, it became an inconvenient truth, one that officials worked hard to minimize. Outside the island, the world paid little attention. Newspapers in Paris printed small notices, framing the events as minor unrest. Other nations, still recovering from the war, rarely spoke of it. The silence was not accidental. It allowed France to maintain its image as a liberator in Europe while remaining a colonizer in Africa. The hypocrisy was staggering, but few dared to challenge it. In Madagascar, the silence was enforced. Survivors were warned not to speak, and political leaders were imprisoned or executed. The MDRM was dismantled, its members blamed for the rebellion whether guilty or not. Fear settled like a heavy fog. Families mourned quietly, whispering names of the dead at night, passing memory through stories told in kitchens and fields. Officially, the uprising was reduced to a footnote, but in the hearts of the Malagasy, it burned like an unhealed scar. And yet, even as the rebellion ended in ashes, it had planted something indestructible. The people had seen their own strength, had tasted the possibility of freedom. The empire had crushed their bodies, but not their will. The memory of 1947 lingered, hidden but alive, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer contain it. When the gunfire faded and the villages lay in ruins, Madagascar entered a long silence. The rebellion had been crushed, but its memory lingered in whispers and in the scars carved across the island. Families rebuilt homes from ashes, but the grief of lost fathers, mothers, and children hung heavy in every community. Even in quiet moments, the past seemed to echo. Fields where rice once grew were marked by unmarked graves, and forests carried the ghosts of those who had fled and never returned. The French administration tightened its grip. Political leaders were arrested, tried in rush tribunals, and sentenced as scapegoats. Many had never called for violence, but their voices had grown too influential, and silencing them was necessary for colonial control. The MDRM was dismantled, and its surviving members lived under constant surveillance. In the capital, Antananarivo, the message was unmistakable. Political resistance had no place in the colony. For ordinary Malagasy, survival became the focus. Crops had been destroyed during the scorched-earth campaigns, and hunger spread widely in the years that followed. Families rationed food, relying on whatever could be foraged from the forests. Children grew thin, their eyes carrying the weight of hunger and memory. Yet even in this hardship, small acts of remembrance endured. Songs of resistance were sung quietly, and old stories were passed down around fires at night. By the early 1950s, a younger generation began to question the silence. Students in schools asked about the graves that dotted the countryside, about the names that elders mentioned only in hushed tones. Intellectuals began writing essays and poems that hinted at the truth, even when censorship loomed over them. The rebellion had been broken physically, but culturally it remained, woven into memory and identity. France, meanwhile, tried to present Madagascar as stable. Officials spoke of progress of development projects and education, while carefully avoiding mention of the blood spilled only a few years earlier. But cracks had already formed. The uprising had shown that empire was not eternal, that beneath enforced silence lay a people unwilling to forget. In 1956, with the winds of decolonization sweeping through Africa, Madagascar gained limited self-government. Elections were held, Malagasy politicians gained more visibility, and independence was suddenly a possibility. Yet the memory of 1947 lingered over these debates. Some asked whether independence could feel whole when the cost of rebellion had been denied for so long. Others argued that silence was necessary to move forward, that reopening wounds would only divide. Finally, in 1960, the French tricolor was lowered and Madagascar's own flag was raised. The island joined the wave of African nations claiming independence, stepping into the world as a free state. Crowds cheered in the streets, music filled the air, and for a moment it seemed that the pain of the past might be overcome. But beneath the celebrations, elders remembered the price already paid 13 years earlier. For them, independence had been earned not only in negotiation, but in the fire and blood of 1947. Yet official recognition of the uprising remained absent. Leaders spoke cautiously, fearing to strain ties with France. History books gave only brief mentions, if any at all. The rebellion lived not in parades or monuments, but in families, in oral memory, in the quiet determination of a people who knew that their freedom had roots far deeper than politicians admitted. After independence in 1960, Madagascar faced the challenge of nation-building. The government struggled with poverty, political instability, and the weight of colonial legacies. Leaders often avoided speaking about 1947 directly, wary of reopening wounds or provoking France. For a time, the uprising remained a shadow, known by everyone, spoken by few, and officially silenced. But silence never lasts forever. In villages where the massacres had taken place, families continued to tell stories. Mothers whispered to their children about fathers who had never returned. Elders pointed to fields where rice no longer grew, calling them cursed ground, marked by the dead. Even without monuments, memory clung to the soil. By the 1970s, a new wave of Malagasy intellectuals began to push back against silence. Writers and poets published works that carried hidden meanings, using metaphor and allegory to describe fire, blood, and betrayal. Historians quietly gathered testimonies from survivors, even as official archives remained sealed. The rebellion, long suppressed, began to resurface through culture. In the 1980s, political shifts created space for more open discussion. Descendants of rebels spoke publicly, demanding recognition for the sacrifices of their ancestors. Schools slowly began to mention the uprising, though often in cautious tones. The idea that independence had roots in 1947 gained ground, challenging the official narrative that framed 1960 as the sole turning point. For survivors, this recognition came late. Many had grown old, carrying trauma in silence for decades. When finally asked to speak, their voices trembled with both grief and relief. They described homes burned to the ground, neighbors executed, children buried in haste. Their testimonies shocked younger generations who had grown up hearing only fragments of the truth. By the turn of the 21st century, the uprising was no longer hidden. Historians published books revealing the scale of repression. Journalists uncovered French military reports that documented massacres once denied. Memorials began to appear in towns where the heaviest violence had occurred, and each March, ceremonies were held to honor the dead. The silence of decades had finally been broken. France, too, could not ignore the past. Under pressure from scholars and activists, French officials acknowledged the events, though their words were often careful, framed as a tragic necessity rather than deliberate atrocity. Still, acknowledgement mattered. For Madagascar, it was proof that their pain had not been imagined, that the world finally recognized what they had endured. Today, the memory of 1947 is both wound and foundation. It is taught in schools, spoken in parliaments, remembered in songs and poems. Villages hold commemorations, placing flowers on mass graves that were once unmarked. The rebellion is no longer a forbidden subject. It is a symbol of national identity. The uprising of 1947 was more than a failed rebellion. It was the spark that ensured Madagascar's independence could not be denied. the sacrifice that turned silence into legacy. Tens of thousands perished, but their deaths were not in vain. They proved that freedom was not given as a gift. It was claimed, endured, and finally remembered. And as the Malagasy people stand today, proud and independent, they carry not just the memory of 1960, but of 1947, when ordinary men and women chose to rise against impossible odds. Their story is a warning, a lesson, and a testament. Empires may suppress voices for a time, but truth always returns. The story of Madagascar's 1947 rebellion is not just about the past, it is about memory, silence, and survival. For decades, the world ignored the flames that consumed villages and the blood that soaked the soil. But silence could not last. The voices of survivors rose again, and today their sacrifice stands as proof that freedom is never free. If we forget them, we allow injustice to win a second time. If we remember, we give meaning to their struggle and strength to their descendants. Their story is a reminder that history must not be buried, no matter how inconvenient it is for those in power. If you believe these hidden stories deserve to be told, if you want more forgotten voices of resistance and survival to be heard, then join us. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to Slavery's Dark Past. Together, we can ensure that the world remembers.